June 24th, 1314. The Bannockburn isn't running with water. It's running with the English aristocracy. The stream is so clogged with the bodies of armored knights and drowned horses that a man can walk from one bank to the other without getting his boots wet. You're not stepping on mud. You're stepping on the faces of earls, barons, and the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. This isn't a battle. It's a traffic jam of death, a catastrophic failure of logistics, where thousands of men were forced into a narrow kill box and slaughtered by a force a fraction of their size. History will tell you the Scots won the Battle of Bannockburn through bravery. That is a lie. They won because they turned the landscape itself into a weapon of mass destruction. And before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more long-form content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I always find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from all over the world, connected across time and space by the same curiosity about the past. Because to understand how we ended up with a river of corpses, we have to strip away the romantic myths. When we picture medieval battles, Hollywood has trained us to imagine chaotic, honorable duels where the good guys win because they have more heart. But war in the 14th century wasn't about heart. It was about math, physics, terror. And by all measurable logic, what happened here should have been impossible. The English army that marched north that summer was not just a military force. It was a moving city. It was the Death Star of the Middle Ages. Led by King Edward II, the army contained over 2,000 heavy cavalry, medieval tanks, and somewhere between 16,000 and 20,000 infantry and archers. These were professional killers encased in plate and mail, riding destriers bred specifically to trample human beings into paste. And the supply train? It stretched for miles, wagons loaded with gold, wine, and portable wardrobes, because Edward was so confident in victory that he packed for a celebration, not a fight. Opposing this juggernaut was Robert the Bruce, the self-proclaimed King of Scots, and his army was laughable by comparison. Maybe 6,000 men, mostly spearmen, a few light cavalry, no heavy armor, no endless supply wagons, and exhausted from years of guerrilla warfare. If you were a betting man in 1314, putting money on the Scots wasn't even gambling. It was charity. England outnumbered them 3-1, maybe even 4-1. But numbers on parchment don't account for terrain, and they definitely don't account for desperation. Robert the Bruce knew he could not defeat the English in an open field. To try would be suicide, so he didn't. Instead, he decided to change the map itself. The prize at the center of this collision was Stirling Castle, and it's hard to overstate how important that fortress was. Stirling wasn't just a castle, it was the key to the kingdom. Whoever held Stirling controlled the gateway between the lowlands and the highlands. It was the throat of Scotland, and Edward II was coming to squeeze it shut. But there was a catch. A bizarre bureaucratic technicality that actually triggered this entire bloodbath. A year earlier, Bruce's brother, Edward Bruce, had made a gentleman's agreement with the English commander inside Stirling Castle. The deal was simple. If an English army didn't arrive to relieve the castle by Midsummer's Day, 1314, the castle would surrender to the Scots without a fight. It was supposed to be a clever diplomatic squeeze, but instead, it backfired spectacularly. Because it gave the King of England a deadline, a specific date, a specific location. a place where Edward had to show up. For a guerrilla fighter like Robert the Bruce, this was a nightmare. His entire strategy depended on hitting, running, and vanishing into the mist. He survived by being a ghost, and now his brother's foolish agreement forced him to become a wall. He had to stand and fight a pitched battle against the mightiest army in Christendom, on a day chosen by the enemy. When Bruce heard about the deal, he was reportedly furious, likely ready to strangle his own brother, because he knew exactly what awaited him: English heavy cavalry. A charge of 2,000 armored horses was an unstoppable kinetic force, enough momentum to shatter most infantry formations instantly. The ground would shake, the noise would be thunderous, and the psychological impact alone caused many armies to break and run before contact was ever made. So Bruce had a choice: retreat, leave Stirling in English hands and lose credibility as king, or stand and risk the total annihilation of Scotland's fighting power. He chose to stand, but he wasn't going to play by English rules. If the English were bringing a hammer, Bruce wasn't going to be the nail. He was going to be the anvil. He arrived weeks early. He walked the ground of the new park, a hunting reserve south of the castle. He studied the marshy streams of the Bannockburn. He looked at the dense trees, and he began to see it: a killbox. This is where the story stops being about bravery and becomes a masterclass in combat engineering. Bruce realized something critical: the English army's greatest strength, its size and its cavalry, was also its greatest weakness. They were slow. They needed huge amounts of space to maneuver, and they were arrogant. They expected the Scots to run. Bruce decided to weaponize that arrogance. He began preparing the ground, transforming the landscape itself into a trap. And this wasn't just digging a few ditches. This was an industrial-scale excavation project designed to funnel the English into a meat grinder. In the days leading up to the battle, the Scots weren't just sharpening spears, they were digging. Because we often imagine medieval soldiers only as warriors. But here, they were laborers. They dug hundreds of small pits known as pots, not massive moats. Precise honeycombed traps, each about a foot wide, hidden with sticks and grass. And inside each pit, they planted a sharp wooden stake angled upward. Cruel, specific, efficient. It wasn't meant to kill a knight. It was meant to snap the leg of a horse. Because Bruce understood, a knight on a horse is a tank, but a knight on the ground, trapped under a screaming, thrashing animal, is just a man in a metal can, waiting to be opened. The atmosphere in the Scottish camp must have been suffocating. Every man knew what was coming. They could probably feel the vibrations of the English march before they even saw the banners. And when the English finally appeared, it was a spectacle of wealth and power. Their armor shone so brightly in the sun that chroniclers claimed the land itself looked like it was burning with light. This wasn't just an army. It was the full psychological weight of the English crown. They came to crush a rebellion, to hang traitors, to restore order. They didn't expect resistance. They expected a rout. But when the English vanguard approached the Bannockburn on June 23rd, they found the Scots waiting, not hiding in the woods, not scattering for the hills, standing in formation. To English commanders, it must have looked pathetic. A few thousand spearmen in rough tunics, standing against the glimmering tide of chivalry. But the visual disparity was part of the trap. Bruce wanted them to attack. He needed them to commit. He dangled the bait. Knowing that English knights, driven by chivalric pride and a hunger for glory, would not be able to resist charging. And he was right. The stage was set for one of the most shocking upsets in military history. But before the armies clashed in full, one moment of individual violence would set the tone for everything that followed. A moment that feels like something out of a scripted movie, where a king gambles his life and his nation on a single swing of an axe. It is the afternoon of June 23rd. The main English army is still struggling through narrow roads to the south, but the vanguard has arrived. Eager young knights, glory hunters, led by the Earls of Gloucester and Hereford. They ride into the new park, expecting to scatter a few terrified peasant skirmishers. And instead, they see disciplined Scottish formations waiting, and out in front of the lines, the king himself. Robert the Bruce isn't hiding. He's wearing a golden circlet around his helmet, a shining target that screams, "I am the king." But there's a problem. Bruce isn't riding a massive warhorse. He's on a small, nimble palfrey, basically a pony, meant for travel, not battle, to an English knight. This looks like a gift from God. Enter Sir Henry de Bohun. He is young, heavily armored, riding a destrier that weighs as much as a small car. He sees the crown. He sees the small horse. And in his mind, the war is already over. He believes he's about to end the Scottish rebellion with a single lance thrust and become the greatest hero in English history. He lowers his lance. He spurs his monster of a horse, and he charges. And in that instant, history holds its breath. By every rule of medieval warfare, Robert the Bruce should have retreated. A man on a pony does not joust with a fully armored heavy cavalryman. It's physics. If Sir Henry de Bohun's lance connects, the kinetic force will punch through Bruce's armor and rip him out of the saddle like a rag doll. His commanders are probably screaming internally for him to run. Scotland's entire future is sitting on that small horse. But Bruce doesn't move. He sits perfectly still, watching the English knight thunder toward him. The ground shakes. The distance closes. 80 yards. 40. 10. And then, at the last possible moment, just as the steel tip is about to pierce his chest, Bruce pulls the reins. He doesn't panic. He pivots. His small, agile horse sidesteps the charging destrier with the grace of a matador dodging a bull. De Bohun misses. His momentum carries him past the king, exposing the side of his helmet and the back of his head. And in that split second, Bruce rises in his stirrups. He's holding a battle axe. He doesn't swing wildly. He brings it down with the precision of a woodcutter splitting a log. The axe strikes de Bohun's helmet with such force that it doesn't just dent the steel, it cleaves straight through it. The blade splits the helmet and the skull beneath it from crown to chin. The wooden handle of the axe shatters from the impact. Sir Henry de Bohun is dead before his body even hits the ground. And for a heartbeat, everything goes silent. Then the Scottish lines erupt. Cheers, shouts, roars. Because what just happened wasn't simply a duel. It was a psychological nuclear bomb. The English vanguard freezes. They just watched their champion, fully armored, mounted on a living tank, get erased by a man on a pony with an axe. The invincibility of the English knight is shattered in an instant. Bruce rides back to his lines, calm and composed. His commanders rush to him, furious. They scold him for risking everything on a moment of bravado. And Bruce, holding the splintered wood of his axe handle, simply shrugs and says, "I have broken my good axe." That one sentence lands like the final insult. The English vanguard, rattled and suddenly uncertain, retreats. But they don't leave. They pull back to the wet, marshy ground known as the Carse to camp for the night. And they are angry. humiliated, thirsty, so they begin to drink. Meanwhile, the Scots don't celebrate. They can't. Bruce knows the real storm is coming tomorrow. He has won an opening move, yes. But the full weight of Edward's army, 20,000 angry men, is still marching toward him. And that night, something happens that changes everything. A traitor crosses the lines. As darkness settles on June 23rd, the two armies are separated by less than a mile. But they exist in two different universes. The Scots are camped in the sheltered woods of the new park. They're eating oatmeal, praying, resting, focused, ready. The English, however, are in hell. Because after being checked by Scottish traps and the terrain during the day, they have moved down into the Carse of Balkitterock. The name sounds like fantasy, but in reality, it's a tidal flat, a marshy, mosquito-infested bog bounded by the Bannockburn and the River Forth. Now imagine 20,000 men and thousands of horses trying to sleep in a swamp. The ground is so soft, the horses sink to their fetlocks. The men can't lie down without soaking in freezing mud. There is no space to pitch tents. They're packed shoulder to shoulder, wet, exhausted, and unsettled. And that morale shock, watching de Bohun get killed by the Scottish king, festers like a wound. Discipline starts to fray. The supply wagons issue wine instead of water, and a drunken, nervous hum rises through the bog. This isn't an army resting for battle. It's a mob trapped in mud. And somewhere in that chaos, a shadow slips away from the English camp, moving toward the Scottish lines. His name is Sir Alexander Seton, a Scottish knight, fighting for the English. But what he saw during the day has shaken him. He's brought before Robert the Bruce, and he delivers intelligence that shifts the course of history. Seton tells him, "Sir, if you wish to win Scotland, the time is now. The English have lost heart." He confirms what Bruce already suspected. The English are disorganized, cramped, choking on their own numbers. They're packed so tightly into the narrow neck of land between the watercourses that they can't properly deploy. Bruce realizes the English have made a fatal logistical mistake. They've parked a Ferrari in a closet. They have power, but no room to use it. And that leads Bruce to make a decision that defies medieval convention. Usually, the smaller army stays defensive. They wait. They pray the enemy makes mistakes. But Bruce decides that at first light, he will not wait to be attacked. He will attack. He orders his men to prepare for a dawn assault using a formation that will become legendary, the Schiltron. To understand why the next day becomes a slaughter, you have to understand what a Schiltron really is. It's not just a crowd of men holding sharp sticks. It's a mobile fortress, a bristling hedgehog made of 500 men. They form circles or ovals, ranks deep. The outer ranks kneel, planting the butts of their 12-foot pikes into the ground, angling the steel tips outward at the height of a horse's chest. The ranks behind them stand, holding their pikes level at rider height. And here's the key. Bruce trained these formations to move. Unlike the static phalanxes of antiquity, these Schiltrons could advance while maintaining discipline. They weren't walls, they were steamrollers. The physics are simple and brutal. Cavalry cannot find a surface area to hit. No horse, no matter how trained, will willingly charge into a solid forest of steel points. It will shy away, swerve, rear up. And by advancing these living hedgehogs into the English position, already cramped by rivers and marsh, Bruce intends to compress the English army until they literally cannot lift their arms to fight. He is going to use the English army's own mass to crush it to death. Dawn breaks on June 24th, 1314. The sun rises over a battlefield that looks wrong. The English army, stiff, cold, and hung over from a sleepless night in the marsh, looks up and sees something impossible. The Scots are not retreating. They are not holding the defensive line in the woods. They are marching out. 3 massive divisions of schiltrons emerge from the tree line, advancing into the open plain like slow-moving mountains of steel. King Edward II watches from horseback, bewildered. He turns to his experienced commander, Sir Ingram de Umfreville, and asks a question that exposes his disconnect from reality. Will yonder men fight? At that moment, the Scottish army halts. Thousands of men drop to their knees. To Edward, it looks like surrender. He laughs. They kneel, he says. They ask for mercy. But Umfreville, who understands the Scots, feels dread. He answers, They ask for mercy, sire, but not from you. They ask it of God. For these men will conquer or die. And as the Scots rise, the psychological trap snaps shut. Because the English vanguard, driven by ego, makes a fatal mistake. At the head of that vanguard is the Earl of Gloucester. The night before, the king accused him of cowardice, and Gloucester, desperate to prove his loyalty, does not wait for archers. He does not wait for infantry support. He orders an immediate heavy cavalry charge. This is the collision of 2 eras. 500 knights against a moving wall of pikes. The English horses thunder uphill, expecting peasants to scatter. They don't. The schiltrons lock into place. Front ranks kneel, rear ranks brace. And when the cavalry hits, the sound, according to chroniclers, is like a building collapsing. But it isn't the Scots breaking. It's the English cavalry shattering against an immovable object. Gloucester is thrown from his horse and hacked to pieces almost instantly. Scores of knights are impaled on 12-foot spears. Horses rear and thrash in agony, crushing their own riders, breaking the momentum of the charge behind them. And then the forest of spears does something truly terrifying. It starts to walk forward. Now imagine the English infantry behind the knights. They're stuck. They're trapped in a bottleneck, bordered by the Bannockburn on one side and another stream on the other. They can't move left. They can't move right. And now a wall of steel is pushing their own cavalry backward into them. This is the beginning of the crush. The English army is so massive it becomes its own prison. The men in the back push forward, eager to fight, unaware of the slaughter at the front. The men at the front try to retreat to escape the spears. Pressure builds. Ribs begin to crack. Men are lifted off their feet by sheer density. They aren't dying from swords yet. They're dying from compression, from asphyxia. The Scots have engineered a human trash compactor, and the English army is the garbage. And at this point, any student of history should be screaming one question. Where are the archers? Where are the archers? Because the English longbow is the most devastating weapon of the age. 14 years earlier, at the Battle of Falkirk, the English shattered William Wallace's schiltrons by standing back and raining arrows until the Scottish formations collapsed. A schiltron is a fortress against cavalry. But against arrows, it's just a dense target. The English commanders know this. They aren't stupid. They're just trapped. They're boxed in by the terrain and by their own numbers. Still, desperation breeds creativity. And eventually, the English managed to maneuver a large body of Welsh archers out to the flank. They scramble up a steep slope on the Scottish left. And for Robert the Bruce, this is the moment of maximum danger. Because if those archers get time to plant their feet, draw their bows, and loose volleys into the schiltrons. The Scots will be shredded in minutes. The archers reach position. They nock arrows. They raise bows. And just as the first volley is about to fly, a thunder of hooves erupts from the Scottish rear. This is Sir Robert Keith, the Mareschal of Scotland. He leads a small elite force of around 500 light cavalry. They've been held back the entire battle for one purpose: kill the archers. The timing is surgical. Archers are deadly at distance, but defenseless up close. They wear no armor. They carry little more than knives. And because they were rushed into position, they haven't had time to plant their defensive stakes. Keith's cavalry hits them from the side like a hammer striking glass. It isn't a battle. It's an execution. The archers are cut down before they can loose a single effective volley. The survivors panic, and this is where the disaster multiplies. Because they don't flee away from the battlefield. They flee back into it. Screaming, terrified archers stampede straight into the packed ranks of their own infantry. Chaos explodes. The English army is now fighting itself. Infantry, already compressed by the advancing schiltrons, is suddenly being trampled by its own retreating missile troops. Communication collapses. The rear ranks still think they're winning and push forward. The front ranks are being crushed. The center becomes a swirling mosh pit of confusion, and with the threat of the longbow removed, the Scottish schiltrons become invincible. They have no natural predators left on the field. Bruce sees it, he feels it, and he orders his entire line to advance. The hedgehog is no longer defending, it is hunting. The Scots push forward in a rhythm of stabbing steel, roaring, "On them! On them!" The English knights, the proudest warriors in Europe, are trapped in a nightmare. Pinned so tightly against one another, they can't even lift their weapons to swing. Men faint from heat and pressure, then fall and vanish beneath boots. The ground becomes a slurry of blood, mud, and marsh water. Bannockburn stops being a contest of skill. It becomes a contest of space, and the English army is running out of room to exist. By mid-morning, the battlefield is no longer a battle. It's a crushing machine. The schiltrons keep advancing step by bloody step, compressing 20,000 men into a space physically too small to hold them. The English are being forced back against the steep banks of the Bannockburn. They're trapped between a wall of Scottish spears and a deep, muddy stream. And here, medieval warfare reveals its true horror. Because it isn't the sword that kills the most men, it's pressure. As the Scots push forward, the English rear ranks instinctively push back to avoid the water. The result is a terrifying phenomenon called crush asphyxia. Thousands of men are pressed together so tightly their lungs can't expand. Knights in heavy armor are lifted off their feet simply by density, suspended upright, helpless, dying of suffocation while still standing. Those who fall are finished. They're trampled into the mud by their own comrades. The ground turns slick and crimson, a slush of blood and earth and swamp water. The noise is indescribable, steel on steel, horses screaming, men choking and crying out. A wall of sound that swallows commands whole, and the Bannockburn itself begins to fulfill its destiny. As the English line buckles, men and horses are forced backward into the ravine. The banks are steep and slippery. Heavily armored knights slide down into the water and crash into one another. They drown in inches of water, weighed down by steel, pinned by the bodies of their friends. The stream becomes a dam of corpses. For the Scottish soldiers, this is savage vindication. For years they have been hunted, starved, butchered by these same English lords. Now the roles are reversed. They aren't fighting individual duels. They're working like a threshing machine, harvesting the English army row by row. King Edward II watches from the rear, witnessing the impossible. His war machine is eating itself. His commanders are dead. His archers are scattered. His infantry is suffocating. The greatest army in Christendom is dissolving into a panic-stricken mob. But the final blow, the one that transforms defeat into a legendary rout, is still waiting. Because the battlefield is about to be haunted by an army that doesn't even exist. High above the battlefield, on the crest of Gillies Hill, a new formation appears. To the blood-soaked, terrified English soldiers below, it looks like reinforcements. Thousands of fresh troops cresting the ridge, waving banners, shouting war cries that echo down into the valley. They bang weapons on shields, creating a terrifying roar. The English see it and despair. We can't even beat the Scots in front of us. How can we possibly fight another army? And the panic, bubbling under the surface all morning, finally detonates. The cry spreads. They have fresh help. Run, run for your lives. But here's the twist. That army on the hill? It isn't an army. It's the small folk, the camp followers, the cooks, wagon drivers, blacksmiths, the women and children. They've been watching from the rear. And seeing the Scots winning, they grabbed whatever they could find. Blankets tied to poles to look like flags, pots and pans to sound like drums, pitchforks and ladles instead of spears. They rushed down not even to fight, but to cheer and plunder. But fear is a hallucinogen. In the haze of battle, the English don't see cooks and washerwomen. They see the angel of death. The illusion is perfect, and the psychological dam breaks. English resistance evaporates instantly. This is the moment the battle ends, and the hunt begins. Rear ranks that haven't even drawn swords yet turn and flee. But remember the terrain. They're boxed in. As they turn to run, they collide with the men behind them. The formation disintegrates into a stampede. The Scots drop their pikes. They draw swords and axes. The discipline of the Schiltron becomes the fury of the chase. What follows is not war, it is massacre. English soldiers flee everywhere, toward Stirling, toward the river, into the deadly marshes of the Forth, and the small folk rush in, proving that perception can kill just as effectively as steel. The mightiest army in Europe has been routed by a trick of the light and a few bedsheets. In the chaos, a frantic struggle unfolds around King Edward II. Not to kill him, but to save him from his own incompetence. His bodyguards realize the battle is lost. The Earl of Pembroke literally grabs the reins of the king's horse and drags him away from the slaughter. Edward, dazed and humiliated, is forced to turn his back on his dying army. But one man makes a different choice. Riding near the king is Sir Giles de Argentine. You've probably never heard his name, but in 1314 he was a superstar. Widely considered one of the best knights in Europe, a celebrity athlete of the medieval world, famous in tournaments from France to the Holy Land. As the royal party breaks away, de Argentine reins in his horse. He looks at the fleeing king, then back at the Scottish lines, where his comrades are dying, and he delivers one of the harshest resignation letters in history. "Sire, your reign was committed to me. You're now safely on your way, but I am not accustomed to fleeing, nor shall I start now. I commend you to God." Then he spurs his horse. He doesn't ride south toward safety. He rides north, straight back into the heart of the Schiltrons. It is a suicide run. He charges into the forest of spears, cutting down Scots until he is pulled from his horse and slain. He chooses death over dishonor. It is the last gasp of chivalry, dying in the mud of Bannockburn. Edward's humiliation continues. He rides to the gates of Stirling Castle, the very fortress he came to save, screaming to be let in. But the constable, Sir Philip Mowbray, refuses, because the castle must surrender to the Scots per the agreement. And if the king enters, he becomes a prisoner. The King of England is rejected by his own castle. Defeated and homeless, Edward flees south, hunted by Sir James Douglas, Black Douglas. Douglas has only 60 horsemen, not enough to attack outright. So he shadows the king, close enough to harass him. He denies him food, denies him rest. For miles, the king is hunted like a fox until he finally reaches a ship at Dunbar. He escapes with his life, but leaves behind his honor, his army, and the crown jewels. Back on the field, slaughter continues until sunset. The Bannockburn becomes so full of bodies the Scots can cross it dry-shod, bringing us full circle to the image we began with. And when the looting begins, the Scots realize they haven't just won a battle. They've captured the GDP of a small nation, Edward packed for a celebration. So his baggage train, miles of wagons filled with gold, wine, and treasures, now belongs to Scotland. In a single day, one of the poorest nations in Europe becomes rich. And you might think after losing so spectacularly, Edward II would admit defeat. He does not. For 14 years, he refuses to recognize Robert the Bruce as king. The war drags on. The Pope, influenced by English gold, keeps Bruce excommunicated. Technically, in the eyes of the Church, the hero of Bannockburn is an outlaw, but the Scots learned something in that Killbox. They learned the impossible was possible. And in 1320, the Scottish barons gather at Arbroath Abbey to draft a letter to Pope John, what becomes the Declaration of Arbroath. And it isn't just a plea, it's a manifesto, a revolutionary statement that plants seeds for modern democracy. They tell the Pope that Robert the Bruce is king only because he's good at the job, and if he ever betrays Scotland, they will remove him and choose someone else. That idea, that a king works for the people, was unheard of, and in the most famous passage they write, "For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself." That belief, freedom as a natural right worth dying for, echoes across the centuries. Thomas Jefferson reportedly studied it. You can hear its voice in the American Declaration of Independence. The blood spilled in the Bannockburn watered the tree of liberty that would bloom centuries later. Finally, in 1328, the inevitable happens. Edward II is gone, deposed by his own wife and her lover, and reportedly murdered in a way too gruesome to describe here. His son, Edward III, signs the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton. Scotland is formally recognized as independent. Robert the Bruce is recognized as king. The impossible victory is complete. But for Bruce, the triumph is bittersweet. He spent his life sleeping in caves, fighting in mud, carrying the weight of a nation. By the time peace arrives, he is dying, likely of leprosy. He won his crown, but won't live long to wear it in comfort. Still, he dies knowing he did the one thing he promised. He kept Scotland free. Today, if you visit Bannockburn, you won't find a bridge of corpses. You'll find a quiet, wind-swept field near modern Stirling, and standing guard over that silence is a massive bronze statue of Robert the Bruce, mounted on a warhorse. axe raised, frozen forever in defiance. But it's easy to fall into romanticism, to believe the Scots won because they were simply braver, because they had more heart. That does a disservice to what actually happened. The lesson of Bannockburn is not passion, it is intellect. Bruce didn't defeat Edward because he shouted louder. He defeated him because he understood the environment. He turned Scottish geography into a weapon. He used the pots to neutralize horsepower. He used the schiltrons to neutralize mass. He used the small folk to weaponize fear. It was asymmetric warfare at its finest, still studied in military circles today. It proves that when David fights Goliath, David doesn't win by playing Goliath's game. He wins by changing the rules. And Bannockburn becomes more than a battle. It becomes a national identity. A story built on one radical idea, that sovereignty belongs to the people, not the crown. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by something too big, a corporation, a government, or just life itself, remember the Bannockburn. Remember the biggest war machine in Europe was dismantled by starving men who knew exactly where to dig a hole. Sometimes you don't need a bigger army. You just need to hold your ground, sharpen your spear, and wait for the giant to step into the trap. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the brutal engineering of medieval warfare, help us win our own fight against the algorithm by hitting like and subscribing. It genuinely makes a difference. And check out the video on your screen now to see how another impossible victory changed history forever. Until next time, keep questioning the official story.